I had just moved into town a couple of months ago. After turning 18, the orphanage could no longer accommodate me. Now, I was out in the world trying to figure my life out. My sweet but nosy landlady pulled some strings and got me this pizza delivery job. The owner went to the same church, and she got me an interview for the job. Fast forward a month later, I took to the job like duck to water and got along with the owner really well. Most nights, I enjoy the peaceful drives and the small talk with customers until that one night last week. Snow had been falling steadily all evening, and the roads were getting slick. Around 8 p.m., we got an order for a medium pizza, some side orders, and drink. The address was on the outskirts of town, in a more rural area. I sighed and wondered if I would get a decent tip for the trouble, especially in this weather. It was a quiet night, and we only had a couple of orders, so I decided to make the delivery. I grabbed the pizza and headed to my car, an old Honda Civic that had seen better days. The heater barely worked, and the windshield wipers struggled against the accumulating snow. As I drove through town, the houses became fewer and farther between, the streetlights dimming until they were almost non-existent. The address led me to a small, isolated house surrounded by tall, dark trees. The driveway was covered in a thick layer of snow, and I had to park on the road and trudge through the snow to the front door. I knocked, and after a moment, an elderly man answered. He had a kind face, but his eyes seemed tired. "Thank you," he said, handing me a generous tip. "Drive safe out there. These roads can be treacherous." I nodded and made my way back to the car, eager to get home and out of the cold. As I started the engine, I noticed the snow was falling even harder now, and the wind had picked up, making visibility poor. I turned the car around and headed back the way I came. About 10 minutes into the drive, the car's radio started to flicker, static cutting in and out. I fiddled with the dial, but all I got was more static. I switched it off and focused on the road ahead. The snow was coming down in thick, heavy flakes, and I had to slow down to a crawl. As I navigated a sharp curve, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a long white dress that looked out of place in the freezing weather. She had long, dark hair that hung down her back, and she wasn't wearing a coat. I pulled over, thinking she might need help. I rolled down the window a crack. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" She turned to look at me, and my heart nearly stopped. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark and hollow. She didn't say anything, just stared at me with a look of deep sorrow. Feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, I quickly rolled up the window and drove off, glancing in the rearview mirror. She was gone. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the snow playing tricks on me. A few miles down the road, my car started to sputter. The engine was struggling, and I had to pull over. I popped the hood and got out, the wind cutting through my jacket like a knife. As I fumbled with the engine, I heard a faint voice on the wind. It sounded like a woman whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. I tried to start the car again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Frustrated and cold, I decided to walk back to the last house I'd delivered to, hoping they'd let me use their phone since I was not receiving any signal on my mobile. As I trudged through the snow, the whispering grew louder. It seemed to come from all around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees loomed overhead, their branches creaking in the wind like twisted fingers. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the house up ahead. The lights were still on, and I felt a small surge of relief. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and the door creaked open. I stepped inside, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" The house was dark and silent. I made my way to the living room, where a fire was burning low in the fireplace. There was no sign of the old man. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of a photograph on the mantel. It was a picture of the old man and a woman, the same woman I'd seen on the road. "Hello," a voice said from behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was the old man. He walked slowly to where I was standing, leaning on his walking stick for support. He looked sadly at the woman in the picture and said, "Emma." "Her name was Emma." "Was?" I asked, not wanting to hear the answer, but I knew, even when I had seen her by the side of the road, that something was off. "Yes, was. How can I help?" he asked, changing the subject. "I am so sorry for walking in uninvited." I did knock on the door. No one answered, and the door was open. "I know it is not an excuse. I do apologize." I stammered, not wanting him to complain to my boss for this intrusion. "My car broke down. Can I use your phone to call for roadside assistance?" "Sure, you can wait here out of the cold," he said, and left the room without waiting for an answer. It was already 9 p.m., and the wind had picked up again. Roadside assistance was going to come in about an hour or so, depending on the weather and state of the road. They said they were going to pick me up first, and then look at the car. "What did they say? How long are they going to be?" asked the old man, who seemed to appear suddenly out of nowhere without making any sound. "About an hour, give or take." "Thank you, sir." I was really grateful for his help. He waved his hand and said it was the decent thing to do. "You can call me John." I sat down in an armchair overlooking the front of the house and the driveway. There was a music box sitting on a small coffee table next to the armchair. I absent-mindedly ran my finger around the ornate edges. Emma used to listen to this every night after dinner. She loved it. A gift from her mother. "Oh, it is beautiful," I answered awkwardly. He sat in the armchair across me, leaning this cane against the armrest. He said she took her own life. I watched him silently as he leaned his head back and gave me a sideway glance. "I still see her." I was quite confused and mumbled, "Excuse me?" He dropped his head and looked at his hands on his lap. He said, "I know how this sounds, but I see her walking down the road every year on the anniversary of her death. Tonight would be 10 years since her passing. Did you see her?" he asked, still looking at his lap. I hesitated and slowly recounted my experience. "I am not sure what I saw, but she resembled the woman on the picture." My voice trailed off. When I finished speaking, I realized he was staring at me intensely. "Why did you come back here, really?" he said quietly, but there was an undertone of threat in his voice. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room changed from warm and welcoming to chilly. He got up and waddled towards me with surprising speed, pointing his cane towards my face. "You came for her," he screamed. His eyes were wild and crazed. "You won't take her away from me." I tried to calm him down, but before I could defend myself, he had raised his cane and smacked me hard on my head, knocking me unconscious. I don't know how long I was out, but the room looked darker and everything was silent outside. It had stopped snowing, and the wind had calmed down as well. I looked around the room. There was no sign of the old man. A moment not too soon. I saw the light coming up the driveway. It was the roadside assistance. I was terrified, John. The old man would come back and attack me again. I dragged myself quickly to the door and out into the cold winter air. I heard footsteps behind me. John ran towards me, screaming, and he started slamming his walking stick on my back. We both fell to the ground, and now he was on my back, still hitting me. He was quite strong for his age, and I suspected I had a concussion, which made it harder for me to fend him off in my weakened state. Suddenly, he was lifted off of me and thrown to the ground. There was a big guy standing over him, pinning him to the ground with one foot on his chest. The old man waved his arm around, trying to reach for his cane. I quickly pushed it out of his reach and thanked the guy and his good timing. His name was Matthew, the mechanic from roadside assistance. He called the police and an ambulance for me. Turned out, I had a fractured skull and concussion. During the police investigation, they checked the property to see if there was no one else who needed help, but they found more than what they had bargained for. In the basement, they found the body of the woman in the white dress, Emma. Well, they found her 10-year-old remains. The truth was both horrifying and incredibly twisted. Emma, the woman in white, was his stepdaughter. After his wife, Emma's mother, disappeared, he had isolated her from everybody, even her biological father. He told them she was off to boarding school, and she had promised to call them when she could. No one questioned this and thought Emma was living her life and did not want to keep in touch with them. For 15 years, he kept her in captivity, and I dare not imagine what else he did to her. He had kept her chained in the basement for years, and one day, when he was away on a business trip, she had managed to get out of the chains. Crawled out of a window, she ran outside, hoping to find help. It is not known if Emma had seen the outside world during her captivity, or if she knew the area at all. The property was isolated, and without a car, it made it harder to get into town in heavy snow. Before leaving, John had disconnected the phone and hidden it away, just in case. John told authorities later, after his arrest, that Emma was not allowed to use the phone. There was a snowstorm that night. She had walked along the road for nearly half an hour before succumbing to the cold and was found the next morning. There was a burial, and no one questioned the red marks left by the chains around her ankle. Her death was determined to be accidental by the coroner. What's more disturbing was that John was so obsessed with her, he dug her back up and kept her body in his basement all those years. He thought I came to the house to take her away from him, and that was why he attacked me. To him, Emma was still alive. This new development led authorities to reopen the case on the disappearance of Emma's mother. They brought in cadaver dogs as a last-ditch effort, since it's been nearly 30 years since she went missing. No one thought anything would come of it. Sadly, they found the mother's remain in the shed in a shallow grave. A few days ago, I was released from hospital and found my car was parked on the driveway. Matthew had dropped it off that same night with the paperwork. He did not charge me anything and stated the car was in good working order. Confused, I called him. He said the car had started up without any issue. He had inspected the car and found nothing was wrong with it. It probably just overheated, he concluded. There was no steam coming off the car that night, and I had the car serviced recently. Skeptical, I took the car to a garage for a full workup. They did not find anything that would explain why it had shut down after driving for barely half an hour that night. I wonder if Emma had anything to do with it, and the whisper I heard on the walk back to the house. Was she asking for help? I heard both Emma and her mother were laid to rest yesterday by her aunts and uncles. Her mother's remains were in bad condition, and no one was able to determine the cause of death. I hope now they are both at peace. John is still in jail, awaiting trial. He was unable to post bail. This incident has changed me. I will never view the world in the same light. John looked like a normal 70-year-old man, and I would have never imagined the monster he truly was. Delivering pizzas has always been a pretty straightforward gig for me. I've been at it for about 3 years. It pays decently and fits around my schedule as a part-time community college student. It was a chilly December evening, and I was nearing the end of my shift. Around 10 p.m., I got an order from a place I'd never delivered to before, way out in the countryside. The address was for an old house on the outskirts of town, near the edge of the forest. I hesitated, but my manager said the customer had promised a generous tip, which swayed me to take it. I hopped into my rusty old car, a Toyota Corolla that had seen better days, and set off. The drive took me through familiar suburban streets, then out onto a long, winding road flanked by tall trees. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. After about 20 minutes, I turned onto a narrow dirt road. The house at the end was large, but clearly ancient, with ivy creeping up its walls and broken windows staring like empty eyes. I parked the car and grabbed the pizza. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunching of gravel under my feet. I walked up to the front door and knocked. After a few moments, the door creaked open and a woman appeared. She was tall and thin, with long dark hair and piercing green eyes. Her clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of a different era. "Good evening," she said in a soft, almost melodic voice. "You must be the delivery boy. Please, come in." Reluctantly, I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with flickering candles casting long shadows on the walls. The air smelled of herbs and something else, something metallic. The woman led me down a hallway lined with strange old portraits, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked. It felt like I had stepped back in time with all these antique furniture. No electricity, only candles for light. "Just put the pizza on the table in the dining room. Let me get my purse. Wait here," she instructed, gesturing to a large wooden table in the center of the room. I placed the pizza down, looked around at the dust-covered furniture and cobwebs draping the ceiling and curtains. I waited for a couple of minutes, but the creepy vibe of this house got to me. Just as I was about to head for the door, I heard a whisper. It was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the house.
"Stay.
The voice said.
We need you."
I paused and looked in the direction I thought the voice came from. There was no one. Freaked, I decided to leave without my tip. I ran to the front door and tried to open it. It was locked. I threw my weight against it. It won't budge. The small window in the entrance was too small for me to fit through. I ran back to the living room. I remember there was a bay window in there. I pulled the curtain aside and noticed the bars on the window. There was no way I could get out through there. Terrified, I ran down the hallway, searching for another way out. The portraits seemed to leer at me now, their eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. I tried each door I came across. The first two was locked, and the third was unlocked. I ran in looking frantically for the window when I realized in horror there was no window in that room. It was then that I noticed the strange symbols drawn on the floor in chalk. In the center was a large circular altar covered in dark stains. Candles surrounded the altar, their flames flickering wildly. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see the woman standing in the doorway, a cruel smile on her face. "You shouldn't have come here," she said as she slowly walked towards me. "We need fresh blood for the ritual, and you delivered yourself right to us." I felt the wall against my back as I backed away. "What are you talking about? Let me out of here." She laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You can't leave. The spirits demand a sacrifice, and you've been chosen." I turned and ran around her, barely missing her hand as her claw-like fingernails scratched my arm. I bolted out of door into the hallway and kept running. I could hear her chanting behind me, her voice rising and falling in a strange, hypnotic rhythm. I burst through a door and found myself in a dark, narrow staircase leading down to a basement. Without thinking, I ran down the stairs, hoping to find another way out. The basement was cold and damp, with a low ceiling that made me crouch as I moved. I could hear the woman's voice echoing down the stairs, getting closer. In the dim light, I saw a small window near the ceiling. It was my only chance. I climbed onto an old wooden crate and struggled to open the window. Just as I managed to pry it open, I felt a hand grab my ankle and her damn nails digging and drawing blood. I kicked and twisted, trying to free myself. The woman's grip was like iron. With one final desperate effort, I pulled myself through the window, tumbling out onto the cold, wet ground outside. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped away, not daring to look back. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I reported the incident to my manager, who called the police. They filed a report for kidnapping and assault. They could see the marks that woman's nails had left on my arm and ankle. Unfortunately, when the officers had gone out to the house, it was abandoned and no one had apparently lived there for over a decade. The owner had passed away, and the property sat there abandoned ever since. I never got any resolution, and I am still having nightmares where I'm back in that house, trapped running for my life with that sinister laughter following me everywhere. I've been a pizza delivery guy for the past few years, ever since I dropped out of college. This job is my main source of income, while I figure out what I want to do with my life. It's not the most glamorous work, but it pays the bills. Most nights are pretty routine, delivering pizzas to college students, families, and the occasional late-night partygoers. That night, it was a particularly busy night. I was ready to call it a night and go home. Around 11 p.m., an order came in. A large meat lover's pizza to be delivered to a place on the outskirts of town. The address was unusual, an old farmhouse way out in the country. It was a 30-minute drive, and I wasn't thrilled, but the extra tip would be nice. I hopped into my beat-up old car and set off. The drive took me through familiar suburban streets, then out onto a long, winding country road. The houses became fewer and farther between, and soon I was surrounded by open fields and patches of dense forest. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. After about half an hour, I turned onto a narrow dirt road. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, isolated and dark. I pulled up the long driveway and parked near the front porch. The place looked abandoned, peeling paint, broken windows, and overgrown weeds everywhere. I grabbed the pizza and walked up the creaky wooden steps. As I knocked on the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were no lights on inside, and the air was strangely still. I knocked again, louder this time. After a few moments, the door opened slightly, and I was hit by a musty, stale odor. A man's voice called out from the darkness, "Come in, leave the pizza on the kitchen table." I wondered if the door was already unlocked and my knocking just pushed it open, or did someone open it? Reluctantly, I stepped inside. More tip for me, I thought, trying to calm my racing heart. The interior was just as decrepit as the outside dust-covered furniture, cobwebs in the corners, and an unsettling silence. I walked through the dimly lit hallway, following the voice's instructions. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and I placed the pizza on the table. "Thank you," the voice said. "Your tip is in the drawer." I opened the drawer as instructed, but instead of money, I found an old, tarnished key. Confused, and now in full-on panic mode, I turned to leave, but the door to the kitchen suddenly slammed shut. I was plunged into darkness. Suppressing the urge to scream, I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a set of stairs leading down to what looked like a basement. The door I came through was no longer there. The air grew colder, and I could hear a low humming noise, almost like a machine coming from the basement. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The basement was even darker and colder than the rest of the house. The humming grew louder as I descended, and a faint blue light flickered at the bottom of the stairs. As I reached the basement floor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the room was a large metallic structure, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was covered in strange symbols and pulsating with that eerie blue light. The humming was louder now, almost deafening. I shielded my eyes from the bright light and looked around the room. In the furthest corner of the room, I saw movement. It was hard to make out anything. The man was standing in the shadow just out of reach of the blue light. I had seen enough. I was going to get out of that house, even if I had to break a window to do so. I turned and started to run up the stairs. I had gone up a couple of steps when I felt a sharp pain at the back of my neck, and it felt like I was falling in slow motion. As I landed on the floor, completely paralyzed, I saw the shadow approach me. I wondered how he got to me so fast from across the room. Then, I realized there was more than one person in the room. He was wearing a full-length robe, and his head was covered with the hood. I could barely make out his features. As he bent down to look at me, I saw his eyes. It was bright blue, like the light emanating from the structure, and that was the last thing I saw before everything faded into darkness. I woke up on the front porch of the farmhouse, the morning sun just beginning to rise. My car was still parked where I left it, but the house looked different. The paint was fresh, the windows intact, and the yard well kept. I stumbled to my feet, my head throbbing with pain. I drove off as quickly as I could, wanting to put as much distance between me and that house. I looked at my watch. It was 9 a.m. I had been gone for almost 10 hours, but to me, it felt like mere minutes. I never told anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw. Those beings, That structure, it was all real. I quit my job soon after, unable to reconcile what I had experienced and the 9 hours unaccounted for. I'm always looking over my shoulders now, and I wonder if they will show up again one day. So, I was wrapping up another shift as a delivery driver, thinking about the psychology assignment I had to finish for the next day. You know how it is balancing work, and uni can be a real pain. Anyway, it was around 9 p.m. and I was ready to call it a night when I got one last order. I grabbed the food from the counter, not even bothering to check the address until I got to my car. When I finally looked, I saw it was 45 minutes away. Seriously? I was annoyed, but figured I was already committed, so I might as well get it over with. The drive took me to a business park, way out of town. By the time I got there, all the businesses were closed. The place was deserted. My GPS kept losing signal, and I got lost a couple of times before finally finding the address. It was this old, run-down building at the far end of the park. No lights were on, and the whole area gave off a creepy vibe. I parked my car and walked up to the door, food in hand. I knocked, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint noise coming from inside, like someone shuffling around. The door creaked open a bit, and I saw an eye peering through the gap. Delivery 4. Ross? The door opened wider, and a man stepped out. He looked off. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he had this wild look in his eyes. He didn't say a word, just stared at me. The room behind him was dark, except for the streetlight spilling through the doorway. I noted a dirty sleeping bag in the corner and piles of rubbish around the room. I handed him the food, trying to stay calm. That'll be $25.50. He fumbled in his pockets and pulled out a wad of cash, handing it to me without counting it. I quickly counted it myself. It was exact amount. Just as I was about to turn and leave, he grabbed my arm. His hand was covered in grim, and his fingernails were long with dirt underneath it. "Wait," he said in a low, raspy voice. "Come inside for a moment." He started to pull me into the doorway forcefully. Surprised, I took a few steps back and wrenched my arm out of his grasp. "Sorry, man. I've got other deliveries to make." He stepped closer, watching me intently. "Please." Just for a moment, I could smell a putrid stench emanating from him, and his breath smelled like something had crawled in there and died. "I really have to go." I turned around and ran back to my car without waiting for a response. As I opened the car door, I threw a quick look in his direction and froze. There were 2 pairs of eyes peering out of the doorway behind him. They were just as dirty and disheveled, and were grinning from ear to ear. I could not tell if they were man or woman. Their clothes were baggy, and their hair were long and unkempt. I wondered if these 2 were standing behind the door waiting for the guy to pull me inside. What were they planning to do? If they wanted to rob me, they could have done that easily since I was outnumbered. After I had driven away, my phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from an unknown number. "Thanks for the food. I see you found the place all right. Did you enjoy our little meeting? See you soon." I stared at the message. How did this guy get my number? I didn't reply, just kept driving, constantly checking my rearview mirror. When I got home, I reported the incident to the delivery service. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard anything back. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched for weeks after that. A few days after that incident, there were knocks on the door and the windows in the middle of the night, but I never saw anyone outside. The following month, I decided to end the lease on my flat. I went back home to Texas to be with my family for the holidays. I don't know what those guys had planned for me that night, but I no longer felt safe in my own home. This incident happened last year. I had resigned from the job the following day. Please be careful out there. I've been delivering pizzas for 5 years now, ever since I started college. It's a decent gig, flexible hours, cash tips, and I get to ride my old Honda motorcycle around town. A little about me. My name is Tom, and I'm a junior majoring in computer science. Most nights are pretty uneventful, just dropping off pizzas to friendly families or late-night partiers. It was a Friday, close to midnight, and I was getting ready to finish my shift. My last delivery came in a large pepperoni and a bottle of Coke. The address was on the outskirts of town, a good 20-minute ride. I wasn't thrilled, but over time, pay was always welcome. The ride took me through familiar neighborhoods at first, then past the high school, and finally down an old country road that led to the more rural parts. The houses became fewer and farther between, the streetlights more sparse. The only light came from my motorcycle's headlight and the moon, which was half covered by clouds. The GPS led me to a narrow dirt road flanked by thick woods. I double-checked the address. This was the place. I hesitated for a moment, but since I was already here, I might as well get it over with. As I rode down the bumpy path, I saw an old, dilapidated house at the end. It looked abandoned, broken windows, peeling paint, and an overgrown yard. I parked my bike and grabbed the pizza, feeling a strange sense of unease. I looked around for any sign of life as I walked up the creaky wooden steps and knocked on the door. After a few seconds, the door opened slightly, just a crack. A pale, gaunt face peeked out. The man looked to be in his 60s, with sunken eyes and thin, wispy hair. "Pizza delivery," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He opened the door wider and gestured for me to come in. I really didn't want to, but it was late and I wanted to leave and be on my way home as soon as possible. I stepped inside and immediately regretted it. The place was dark and smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. "Just put it on the table," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. I walked into what looked like the living room. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, and cobwebs hung from the corners. I placed the pizza on an old wooden table and turned to leave. That's when I noticed something odd, a series of Polaroid pictures pinned to the wall. They showed various people, all with terrified expressions, standing in the very room I was in. I felt the chill run down my spine. That'll be $19.50, I said, trying to hurry things along. The man shuffled over to me and handed me a 20. "Keep the change," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with an unsettling intensity. I nodded and quickly walked back to the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard a faint, eerie whisper. It sounded like a woman's voice, but I couldn't make out the words. I turned back to see if the man had said something, but he was just standing there, staring at me. I yanked the door open and practically ran to my bike. As I was about to start the engine, I looked back at the house one last time. In one of the upstairs windows, I saw a face pale and ghostly, with hollow eyes staring down at me. I gunned the engine and sped away, not stopping until I was back on the main road. When I finally got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd escaped something truly sinister. I reported the address to my manager the next day, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably just some weird old guy. But I knew it was more than that. That night haunts me to this day. I still deliver pizzas, but I never go out to that part of town anymore. And every now and then, I think about those Polaroids, the terrified faces, and wonder what happened to those people. And I thank my lucky stars that I made it out alive. Thank you for tuning in to our spine-tingling tales. If you want more, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And remember, when you look in the mirror tonight, make sure it's really you looking back. Until next time, stay spooky.